First, I just wanted to thank the museum for inviting me and hosting me here, and particularly thank you to Danielle for arranging all the travel and accommodation and all those important things. So, in January 1942, there was a conference of primary producers held in Ashburton to discuss the military conscription that had been in place for around a year and a half and the imminent prospect of industrial conscription, which would come in a month later. And amongst the many things that were said at that meeting, one of them was, although every farmer is keen to do his utmost in the supplying of foodstuffs, it must be realised that production cannot be maintained without sufficient and efficient labour. The same speaker went on to say that there is not equality of effort, referring to the war effort. Around 140,000 men are overseas or in military camps, but many men with experience of farm work are at other work, on short hours and high rates of pay. These men cannot be blamed, as it is the system under which we are working, and this class of work is more attractive than farming. So really the Conference of Primary Producers was called to review the situation in primary production after a year and a half of military conscription, and to discuss whether farmers should support or not support the introduction of industrial conscription. And looking at the history that's been written about New Zealand's involvement in the Second World War, there's an awful lot of it in total, but there's not a lot of it about conscription. On the whole, there's obviously a lot of military history, so the campaigns and battles that New Zealanders were involved in overseas. But when recruitment has been talked about, generally there's a focus on the voluntary period where men could volunteer to go and fight, which happened until June 1940. But the period of conscription, which is the majority of the war for the army, 5 years, very little has been written. What has been written has overwhelmingly focused on those men and women who raised pacifist and conscientious objections to serving in the war effort or being industrially conscripted. And for me, at least, both of those trends are somewhat problematic. I would argue that conscription is absolutely integral to New Zealand's war effort in the Second World War. It configures how the war effort is managed. It determines how many men can be sent overseas or how many men can be raised for home defence. And at the same time, it determines how many men and women can be left for the labour force and how they need to be moved around to meet different priorities. There certainly was conscientious objection and pacifism, and it's very important to research and to talk about that. But overall, the extent of resistance to conscription was limited. The number of pacifists and conscientious objectors as a proportion of the men called up, or as a proportion of the population, was relatively small. And most of the debates that happened around conscription were about how priorities should be balanced. How many men should be taken into the army versus how many men should be left in the labour force. Which industries should have the priority amongst them. And also there were questions of equality, which has always been a major concern for New Zealanders, and of course still is, but the question of who should go and fight, in what order should they go and fight, which industries should be prioritised, and who should be forced to take part in the war effort under conscription, who should be exempted to continue on their lives at home. So while there were very vocal and heated debates over conscientious objection and pacifism, most of the debates that took place in New Zealand in the Second World War were about priorities and about the question of equality, sharing the sacrifices or how they should be shared, sharing the burdens of conscription. So as I mentioned, conscription is introduced in New Zealand in July 1940. So that means that for the majority of the Second World War, New Zealand has conscription in place. And army volunteering ceases for Pākehā men. So from the 22nd of July 1940, Pākehā men could no longer volunteer into the army, that the army was raised by conscription. Conscription was not introduced for Māori, or military conscription was not introduced for Māori. They could volunteer throughout the war, but for Pākehā men, it was a question of conscription. Every man between the age of 19 and 46 was mobilized into what was referred to as the General Reserve, and that was the pool of men who would be available for balloting for conscription and for military service. That General Reserve was divided into a first division, who were single men or unmarried men who would be called up first, and then the second division of married men who would be called up once the first division was exhausted. From the start, men who were called up under conscription would be available for overseas service, so they could be sent to fight anywhere in the world. And that's a big difference between New Zealand's introduction of conscription and that of Australia and Canada, where conscripts can only be used for home service. They can't be sent overseas. Every member of the Australian expeditionary force in World War II is a volunteer. Conscripts can only be used for home service in Australia and Canada. And there is a provision for exemption. So if men are called up under conscription and they pass the medical exam, they can still apply for exemption on the grounds that their call up would be a cause of undue hardship to themselves or to their families, that their work was more important, that they should continue farming or in industry rather than going into the army, or they could appeal on the grounds of conscientious objection, that they had objections to serving and killing as part of an army. So it was a very comprehensive system of conscription from the start, and it was implemented in a very comprehensive way as well. So the first ballots, so the first drawing of names to be called into the army, took place in late 1940, and famously Bob Semple, who had himself been arrested for opposing conscription in the First World War, drew the first ballot under conscription in the Second World War. And it proceeded very quickly. So all First Division men, so that's all the single or unmarried men between the ages of 19 and 46, were balloted by the end of 1941. They had to ballot them very quickly because the New Zealanders took so many losses in Greece and Crete. So 123,000 men had been balloted by the end of 1941. So you can see it proceeds very quickly. Things get even more rapid when we move into 1942, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and when there is a genuine fear that the Japanese might be about to invade New Zealand. The entire territorial force is mobilized en masse, and of course there's the exhibition on Westerfield Camp, and many of those territorials would go on to serve their training period in Westerfield. The entire second division, so that's the married men, were balloted by the end of 1942. So by the end of 1942, every eligible New Zealand man between 19 and 46 has been balloted. From that point on, the only people left were those who'd already been exempted or those who achieved the age of military service by getting older. Not only was conscription used for the army, it was also used for the Home Guard, so the Home Defence Force who would be there to respond to an invasion, and for the Emergency Reserve Corps, which was a body used for firefighting and air raid drills and other civil defence tasks that were believed might be necessary if the Japanese did invade.
What was the balloting process you say there? Well, they're all balloted by the end of 1942. What was the point in balloting them, and why didn't they just get called up full stop? What was the ballot?
Well, I mean, obviously it helped if you had the idea was the first division would all be called up first, so you take the single men first. But I mean, even a difference of a few months could make a big difference if it was a farmer and they had the harvest period. No, it was a set of marbles in a tin, so each marble corresponded to a drawer in which all the men's names were kept. So you draw them all individually. Yep, so it was quite a lengthy process. Some of the ballots could take almost a day to take place because it took a long time. Also in 1942, again as part of the climate resulting from the fear of Japanese invasion, conscription was moved into the industrial sphere. So it was used for employment, not just for military service. So industries that were deemed essential to the war effort, if an industry was deemed essential, the workers in that industry could not leave for other employment unless they got special permission, and the employers could not fire workers or sack them again, unless they got special permission to do so. So many New Zealanders became locked into their employment. New Zealanders could also be directed to employment, so the manpower authorities could decide that their current work was not important enough and they could order them to go and do other work, or they could take unemployed people and direct them into work. Employers could also be restricted from employing people, so obviously if you've got non-essential industries, luxury products, those kind of things that you don't necessarily need as part of a war effort, those employers could be prohibited from taking on any extra staff. And another striking fact about industrial conscription is that it applied to women. So military conscription was only for men, but industrial conscription, so that being locked into employment or being directed to undertake specific kinds of employment, that could also be applied to women as well as men. And the totals involved really show just how pervasive and how integral conscription is to New Zealand's war effort. So in total, over 300,000 men are balloted. So that's everyone between 19 and 46. And it's difficult to work out an exact figure because there is some movement between different branches, but I reckon that around 62% of the men who were taken into the New Zealand Army during World War II are conscripts, not volunteers. So despite or alongside the kind of popular image of men willingly joining up or a volunteer force, the majority of the New Zealand Army in the Second World War are actually conscripts, not volunteers. And then you've got to add on as well the people who were conscripted into the Home Guard and the Emergency Reserve Corps. So we're talking hundreds of thousands, perhaps even 500,000 New Zealanders who are affected in some way by military conscription during the Second World War. So it's a vast undertaking. And as I said, it really plays a key role in replacing the losses in the New Zealand Army as the war drags on for so long. In terms of industrial conscription, 255,000 workers, that's around 40% of the entire workforce, are in essential industries. So they're in those industries where you can't leave the industry without permission and where employers can't sack you without permission. And in terms of those direction orders, so when people are given a notice saying you must work in this occupation, over 160,000 of those are issued as well. So again, we're talking significant numbers of New Zealanders being directly impacted by conscription. And this is why I think it's so important that it does get more of a voice in the historiography, because it's so important to the home front experience, to maintaining the army, to maintaining the workforce, and it touches so many New Zealanders directly in this way. So that's the application of conscription. What about the way conscription is talked about and debated? How are these burdens shared, and what do New Zealanders think about the substantial burdens that are being imposed? Well, there certainly were conscientious objectors and pacifists in response to military conscription. One of them, Leslie Hobbs, lodged an appeal for exemption to the Armed Forces Appeal Board, which sat in Ashburton. As a member of the Christian Assemblies, he said he would not take life and he would not serve in any capacity under military control. So he wouldn't even serve in the ambulance or the medical services because his objection was to being part of the military. And as part of his appeal, he said he would help a wounded person if called upon to do so by the mayor of the town, i.e. Ashburton, but not if he was asked by the military. So that was his objection to being called up for the military. But of those 300,000 men who were balloted, less than 2% of them appealed on conscientious grounds. So the vast majority of appeals were lodged on hardship or occupational grounds, if they appeal, and less than half of New Zealanders who were called up actually appealed. So every man could appeal for exemption, less than half of them actually did so. The other half did not lodge that appeal. So as I said, pacifists and conscientious objectors are a small proportion. The majority of debates over military conscription, as I mentioned, are about how it should be allocated, who should be called up, and what order should they be called up under. And farmers were amongst those who debated military conscription most strenuously. So pre-conscription, so in the voluntary period, farmers had been amongst those who most vocally called for conscription. They wanted conscription. They thought it would be a big help to the farming industry. That was because so many farmers and farm workers were enlisting, they were volunteering. And really that's the problem with the voluntary system. You can't control who volunteers. Anyone can volunteer. You want your non-essential people to volunteer, your clerks or your shop assistants. You want them volunteering. You don't want people in essential industries volunteering, but obviously you can't control that. So too many farmers and farm workers were enlisting. It was felt that too many farm workers were leaving for other industries, and there was a constant complaint that public works or occupations in urban areas were paying too well and attracting too many farm workers away from the land, leaving farming denuded of employment. It was felt that if conscription came in, farmers would be able to claim exemption on the grounds of their occupation, that producing foodstuff was sufficiently important for the war effort that they wouldn't have to serve in the military. And there was also a bit of a, if you like, a negative angle to all this. Farmers believed that they were bearing too many of the burdens, and the urban workers, particularly trade unionists, were getting off too lightly. So if you brought in conscription, that would be a way of making the unions do their part. So pre-conscription, farmers were very vocal in calling for it. However, once conscription did come in, farmers were amongst its sharpest critics, arguing that many of their hopes had not been realised. So too many farmers and farm workers were being conscripted. And obviously if you call up every man between 19 and 46, that's going to be a lot of farmers. There was a feeling that replacement labour was unavailable or unsuitable. So not only were men being called up, the available replacements, which could be older men, those who were unfit, or women, were often unsuitable. They didn't understand farming. There was often a complaint from farmers saying, we keep being told there's all these replacements available, but these aren't experienced farm workers. Our experienced workers are going into the army, and we're being sent these people who have no idea how to operate a farm or how to milk a cow or something like that. Farmers' hopes that they would be exempted from conscription were often not realised. Farmers were drafted into the army in significant numbers. And of course, if you're trying to replenish the losses that have been suffered by the New Zealand Army, you're going to have to, as the war drags on, call on farmers and farm workers quite extensively. And farmers were also displeased that what they saw as the unfair privileges given to the unions tended to continue. So coal miners, waterside workers, many of the traditional enemies or freezing workers often were exempted on the grounds that they were in essential industries, whereas farmers less so, or not often enough, according to the farmers. So farmers were critical of conscription when it actually came in. Who did they blame for this? Well, they blamed the appeal bodies. So whenever an appeal for exemption was made, it came before an armed forces appeal board that decided whether the man would be exempted or not. Farmers thought that they were getting a rough deal from the appeal bodies. Again, these were men who didn't understand farming. They didn't understand the needs of a farm. They blamed the military for constantly asking for too many men, and again not recognising that farming couldn't afford to keep sending men off. But mainly they blamed the Labour government. So throughout the Second World War, New Zealand has a Labour government, and farmers were very critical of the government, not just over conscription, but over many things, and constantly accused the government of favouring urban workers and particularly the trade unions. So why should farmers and other private people work 60 hours or more a week and unionists 40? So New Zealand had the 40-hour week throughout the Second World War, and there was considerable anger amongst the farming community that the government didn't abandon that 40-hour week. So once a worker worked 40 hours, anything over that had to be paid overtime, and many employers were unwilling to do that. Many farmers would argue, I'm working 60 hours or more than that a week, I'm not getting paid overtime, so why should they benefit from the 40-hour week when we're not? And again, there was just that feeling that the government didn't understand or was unsympathetic to farming interests. Many of the members of the government were from trade unions or were based in urban areas. Just a general feeling that the government didn't understand and was unsympathetic to the farming community. What about industrial conscription? That process of locking people into their work or directing them to new types of employment. Again, some people resisted industrial conscription on the grounds of pacifism or conscientious objection. So Elsie Barrett, when she was directed to employment at the Kaiapoi woolen mills, she said, "I do not object to making clothes and blankets, but to all work connected with the war." So she argued that even making blankets that would be used by soldiers was contributing to the war effort, and therefore she wanted nothing to do with it.
Excuse me, was Elsie of a particular religion? Or?
She said she wasn't religious. She was a member of the Peace Pledge Union, which was a pacifist organisation, an offshoot of the British Peace Pledge Union. But again, Elsie was very rare. Conscientious objectors to industrial conscription were even rarer than they were to military conscription. And in total, only 3% of all the directions, so all those orders to take up employment, were appealed on any grounds. Most of them were domestic or health grounds. You're directing me into this job, I'm not in sufficient health to do that. Those kind of objections, not conscientious objections or pacifism. Again, the main thrust of complaints about industrial conscription were about how the burden should be shared. Who should it apply to? The sacrifices being equalised. So in 1942, just before industrial conscription came in, the Canterbury Frozen Meat Corporation said that the position at present is that if we are to lose any more of our expert workmen, we will have to close our works and hand them over to the government. They're certainly doing better work for their country at the job they have been trained to do than as raw recruits in the army. So again, that argument that these people are in an essential industry, if you have industrial conscription, you can hold them in their work rather than being sent off to fight. So many employers were vocal advocates for industrial conscription before it came in, just like many farmers were advocates of military conscription before it came in. But again, just like many farmers, many employers were disappointed by what happened. So again, we've got the Canterbury Frozen Meat Corporation appealing the decision of the manpower officer to not allow it to dismiss or to sack 4 women in its employment. So because it was essential industry, they couldn't sack workers unless they got special permission. In this case, the manpower officer has denied them that permission, said they have to keep employing these 4 women. What these 4 women had done was they had verbally and then physically attacked another worker and had actually dislocated her shoulder as part of a physical attack. But they were ordered to keep those women on because the manpower officer said they couldn't dismiss them. So again, just like many farmers, many employers were not that happy with how conscription turned out, industrial conscription turned out, arguing that too many workers were still being taken, so the military was still calling up too many men. And obviously as you get towards 1944, 1945, you're really scraping the barrel, and employers are really struggling for enough workers. The obvious replacement, if your men are being called up, is to bring in women, but many women were choosing to join the Armed Forces Auxiliaries. They couldn't join the Army itself, but they could join the Auxiliary Army or the Auxiliary Air Force. Many employers argued that they were forced to employ unsuitable staff, So they were very critical of the type of labour that was directed to them, again saying these people have no idea what to do in a freezing works, or they don't understand the occupation. And there was that complaint as well that they couldn't sack undesirables. So even people who weren't working hard enough or were committing breaches of discipline, like that attack on the other woman, they then couldn't get rid of them if the manpower officer said they couldn't, because of the essential industry provision. So while employers had vocally called for industrial conscription, many of them were somewhat unhappy with the way it ended up playing out. But it wasn't just employers who complained. Employees also voiced complaints as well. So there were often complaints that they were being forced into undesirable work, and there were particular occupations which people weren't happy with. Canning factories they didn't like. Freezing works were not popular. Mental institutions were particularly unpopular, massive appeals against those types of work. So whenever people were directed into those industries, there was almost guaranteed to be an appeal or a complaint. Class played a lot of influence in this as well. You often had middle class women saying, I'm not going to work in a factory, or I don't want to be working with people like that. Complaints that there was too much obscenity in the workplace, or that there was too much smoking or bad behaviour, and that could be an influence on them. But perhaps the most common complaint that employees made was that they couldn't move around for better wages. If you're locked into your work as part of an essential industry, you kind of lose the traditional right of employees to go somewhere else if you don't like the conditions, or if the wages are better somewhere else. And particularly in the war, when there was a real labour shortage, that tended to drive wages up, but many employees couldn't take advantage of that because they were locked into these often undesirable and lower paid work. The textile factories or the canning factories that were crying out for labour were also tended to be amongst the lowest wage employment, but the workers couldn't move away from them. So again, as with military conscription, industrial conscription, much of the debate is around how it works, how it operates, how the burdens are going to be shared amongst different people. So just to conclude some of what I've talked about, the literature focuses very strongly on the experiences of conscientious objections. And just to emphasise, absolutely, that I am not in any way suggesting that the conscientious objectors were not important, or that their stories shouldn't be told, or that the voices of those who spoke out under massive pressure and at threat of public censure or losing their jobs to raise conscientious objections are not important. But I would argue that alongside those stories, we need a lot more work on conscription as a whole, because conscientious objectors and pacifists made up a relatively small proportion of the hundreds of thousands of New Zealanders who were directly impacted by conscription. And for most of those people, the debate was not around conscription as a principle, whether there should or should not be conscription. The debate was around how it was applied. So who should be taken into the army? Should it be the farmer, or should it be the trade unionist? Should it be the married man or the single man? Should it be the young man or the one who's closer to 46, etc.? And the same happens with industrial conscription. How, again, should the burdens be shared between employers and employees? How do you configure your war effort that allows you to continue to send men to the army, to the New Zealand forces fighting in North Africa or Italy, and then into the Pacific? Or should New Zealand's role be to produce farm, to produce food and supplies for the growing Allied forces? Because ultimately, the number of men that New Zealand could send to fight in the army was a drop in the ocean compared to what the United States or the Soviet Union could contribute. So by the time you get to 44, 45 in particular, there's a real argument that New Zealand should be reducing its military commitment and instead producing farm agricultural produce where it really can make a difference and would obviously help the post-war world as well, where there's going to be major food shortages in Europe and elsewhere. So because there's so much debate around that area, it tends to deepen the polarization within society. As I said, you get those very strong complaints from farmers about the Labour government, that they were favouring trade unionists or they were urban people who didn't understand farming. You get arguments between farmers and people in urban areas about who was bearing the burdens. You get those class debates around who should be conscripted into different occupations. So from my perspective at least, that's the part of the conscription story that needs a lot more focus. Not to say that we shouldn't talk about conscientious objection and pacifism, but I think if we're to really understand New Zealand society in the Second World War and the impacts it has and the way that New Zealand's war effort pans out, we really need to look at some of these debates as well as the ones about the principle. If I haven't bored you sufficiently, I have written a little bit about this. So there's a couple of articles, and the good news is they're both available online, open access, so you don't have to pay for them. Oh dear, might have to pay for that. There's a really great book by Deborah Montgomery, which looks at the women's experience in the war in its entirety, but has a really good section on how women responded to industrial conscription, so recommend that. And probably the best and most comprehensive book on conscription, at least until I finish my one, is still probably Nancy Taylor's volume of the official history, which is 1986, so it's getting on for 50 years old, 40 years old, but still very good and still has an awful lot of information about how conscription was put in place and how people responded to it. Thank you.
Yeah, that was really interesting to hear about a topic, like you say, that often doesn't get a lot of attention, and I'm sure a lot of us here, including myself, didn't already know about that. So, and thank you for putting the Canterbury Ashburton spin on it as well.
That's all right.
That was awesome to just get a bit of a local feel. Right, does anyone have any questions for David?
It's surprising the government didn't legislate on wages then, if there was an unfair burden.
The Labour government was really concerned to avoid inflation. There had been massive inflation in the First World War, and that was often seen as putting a lot of the burden on the working class and allowing certain groups to make quite substantial profits. So the Labour government was very determined that New Zealand would not have inflation, and so a lot of wages were stabilised at certain levels. But again, the argument was that if you allowed, it was more the movement of people, not allowing them to take advantage of those higher wages in other occupations. So yeah, employers were arguing they were paying decent wages to workers who weren't up to the task, but workers were countering to say, we're held in this occupation, we can't leave even if we want to, we can't go and work at the waterside where the Americans are throwing around money left, right and centre to get their ships unloaded. So yeah, it was that, again, that sort of double-sided coin, but certainly the government was very concerned to avoid any perception that there was profiteering or that inflation would be able to take hold.
And was the farming sector objection to conscription genuinely about conscription, or their inbred opposition to Labour government?
I think a bit of both. Obviously they would much prefer that National were in charge, and certainly there was a lot of pressure was put on the Labour government to establish a coalition in wartime to sort of put party interest aside and form a national government. But because they'd won such a massive majority in 1938, they said, we were elected to do this. So, yeah, it's hard to know where the boundary lies, but farmers had a lot of other complaints. There was a long-standing feeling the government was not listening to them. As I said, prices were stabilised, so farm produce, farmers were arguing we're not getting enough money for what we're selling, and therefore we can't compete wage-wise with other industries as well. So again, that was part of the complaint. Why would someone work on a farm where they can go and work on public works or work on the water side for more money? And 40 hours. The 40-hour week was a huge, farmers were constantly saying, why are we working 60, 70 hours? Why have we got our wives working on the farm as well, and our other family members, we're having to bring them in because we've lost all our labourers, and yet these trade unionists in the cities are working for 40 hours or they get overtime. Where's our overtime? So yeah, that was certainly the government was not popular with farmers.
Thank you.
Would you be able to put that previous page up so I can take a photo and get all the books
Oh, yep.
to the front, please?
Yep.
Maybe you could have it emailed to us.
Yes, if you leave me your email addresses, I can then give it to you.
As I said, both those articles are open access, so you don't have to have a subscription or anything like that.
That would be great. Email would be perfect.
David, I have a question.
Yep.
So, with women being conscripted during the war into those farming or factory work, and then how come, or why do you think when the war ended, that didn't lead to women then starting to work more in those industries? Didn't everything just go back to how it was, and then in the 50s we know women's place was in the home and all of that? So.
Yeah, there was quite a substantial backlash after the war. There was a real belief that the men coming home should have their jobs back, and many employers had guaranteed to the men that if they went overseas they would get their jobs back. As I said, a lot of the work that women were doing during the war was not glamorous, or a lot of it was in industries that had really taken off as part of the war, so things like textiles. While and obviously we've got the image for the talk, which is the woman working in the factory, that tends to be the exception rather than the norm. A lot of it is in munitions or tobacco or those kind of jobs. So they're things that partly they scale back down after the war. But yeah, there is that sort of backlash, the feeling that the war was an exception rather than the rule, and now the men were coming back. The woman's place was back in the home, and obviously we have the push to sort of increase the birth rate and those kind of things. So again, all those things sort of play into each other. I mean, there's a huge amount of debate amongst historians as to how much the Second World War, and indeed the First World War, are turning points in the life chances for women. And I think most of the debate now tends to suggest that on a practical level, perhaps not. It was more on the level of conscience that women now had shown that they were just as able to do these things as men, and they gained that sort of sense of belief in themselves, almost, that they could do it. So while it doesn't lead to change overnight, and a lot of things do go back to how they were, I think you can certainly see the seeds of change, in the 70s are starting to be sown by this time. Yeah, but there was that push, and that's really the argument of Deborah Montgomery's book. She argues that the war does not amount to a significant challenge to traditional gender roles, that the role of the wife and the mother was still emphasized even during the war, and then comes very very strongly back afterwards as well.
It's interesting, your figures about conscientious objectors. With as such, what happened to them? Did they have to go into some establishment? Or?
Conscientious objectors are a very diverse group of group of individuals. Some of them who appeal on that grounds were happy to join the military, but they would only do so if they were promised they wouldn't have to bear arms. So some of them were happy to join the ambulance corps, or they would save life, but they wouldn't take it. Some of them were happy to work in civilian work like farming, producing for the war effort, as long as they didn't have to join the military. And some of them wanted absolutely nothing to do with the army and would, took up a pacifist stance. So if they appealed, their appeal would be heard by an armed forces appeal board, which was 3 people who decide whether they were genuine conscientious objectors or not, whether they actually had a genuine objection to war or if they were just making it up because they were scared. And if their appeal was allowed, they would be allowed to stay at home, but they'd have to do other work for the war effort. If it was dismissed, if they were said not to be genuine, and they still refused to join the army, then a number of them were imprisoned. There was a network of defaulters detention camps set up around New Zealand. These were supposed to be nicer than prison, because many of the first Labour government had themselves been imprisoned in the First World War for opposing conscription. I mean, Peter Fraser had been arrested, Walter Nash had been arrested, others, Paddy Webb had been arrested. So yeah, the idea was the defaulters detention camps were better than prison, but they still had to do manual labour. So a lot of them ended up doing things like flax cutting, or many of the forests of the central North Island were actually planted by conscientious objectors during the Second World War, because that was something they ended up doing for 2 or 3 years. So it certainly wasn't great for them, but it was supposed to be better than. So as I said, it really depended on how far they were willing to compromise. If they were willing to join the ambulance corps, then fair enough. It was the ones who wouldn't do anything who tended to suffer, and if they were deemed to be not genuine, then prison or defaulters detention for most of them. The numbers who ended up in prison or defaulters detention, I think, is around 800, is the usual statistic given. Yeah. Many of them were members of the Christian Pacifist Society or the Peace Pledge Union. Some of them just had personal objections to going to fight. Some of them were socialists who, even though we had a notionally socialist government, still said, nothing to do with war. I don't want to kill my fellow workers type argument. So yeah, a very diverse group of men. And now, obviously, we have the memorial down in Dunedin to conscientious objectors from the 2 wars. But yeah.
You said that the Maori, was only Pākehās that were conscripted?
For military service, yeah, Maori could be conscripted industrial.
Yeah, but for military. So, but what about volunteers before that? Did many of them volunteer?
Maori, or in general?
Just in general.
Around 60,000 New Zealanders volunteered before conscription.
But how many of them were Maoris, I'm saying, because they weren't conscripted?
I think around 4,000 Maori volunteered overall. Basically, there was kind of a quid pro quo. The government said, we won't conscript you as long as enough volunteers come forward to keep the 28th Maori Battalion up to strength. It was quite diverse. Certainly, we volunteered much more readily than others. So iwi Ngāti Porou volunteered in quite large numbers. Those that had been victims of the confiscations in the 1860s tended not to, so Waikato sent far fewer volunteers, but on the whole there were just about enough to satisfy the government. I think the government basically decided that because there'd been so much resistance in the First World War by Maori, particularly in the Waikato and the King Country, that better to say volunteer and to kind of have conscription as sort of a stick, we'll do this if you don't volunteer, rather than actually conscripting them, which would have led to massive resistance and problems. So better to get some of them via volunteering than to have a massive uprising. The other problem for the government was that because 1940 was also the centenary of the Treaty of Waitangi. There was already a lot of potential unrest bubbling under the surface. So again, better not to prod that stick. There's also a suggestion that because Peter Fraser was a Scot and many of his ancestors had been the victims of English land clearances, that he kind of had a natural affinity for Maori, so kind of respected their interests. So that's potentially another reason why he didn't conscript. But
How was it regulated? By an Act of Parliament or an order in council?
conscription, orders in council, yeah. Again, the Labour government came in for quite a bit of flack because many of them, as I said, had been conscientious objectors, and the historical party, Labour policy, the Labour Party had actually come into being in 1916 partly to oppose conscription. So some of, they were definitely called hypocrites by quite a few people. They kind of justified it by saying the First World War was an imperialist struggle over nothing. The Second World War is a struggle against fascism. If Hitler gets here, it'll be far worse than if we conscript to fight him. So they sort of tried to get around it that way. But certainly that image of Semple during the first ballot when, he called conscription a Prussian octopus in the First World War. So yeah, it certainly rubbed quite a few people up the wrong way, and you can understand why.
When you talk about the extensive debate that took place in society, you referred to the sectors like the farmers group and the trade unions. Were there other particular organisations or places where debate was influential? I'm thinking about particularly the churches of the time or other organisations?
The churches didn't kick up too much of a fuss about conscription. That they were somewhat concerned about the treatment of conscientious objectors, and particularly as the war rolled on, groups like the Presbyterian Church and the Methodists began to argue that conscientious objectors were being too harshly treated. But no, the churches weren't too forthright about it. Certainly the employers, as I said, were a major one. Farmers. Pretty much every group in society had something to say because conscription, as I said, it impacted everyone. And it was that, I think because equality or egalitarianism was such a key part of the New Zealand psyche, in a way that kind of makes conscription easier to swallow, because conscription says everyone can be conscripted, whereas if you have volunteering, you can have one family sending all of its sons and the family across the street sending none of its sons. So conscription offers that way of equalising things. So I think that's partly why it appealed to New Zealanders. People often called it the fairest way or the most democratic way. But at the same time, because equality was so important, no one could agree what it actually looked like or what fair. It's one thing to say conscription is fair, but everyone's idea of fair differed. So that's why it became such an issue once it did come in, and why groups like farmers, which had advocated so strongly for it, why it inevitably disappointed them, because it's never going to be fair for everybody. The man who gets exempted probably finds it fair, but the person who doesn't get exempted doesn't find it fair. Realistically, it was never going to be a popular policy, but I think the reason why it got in, as I said, is because of that hold of equality and fairness on the New Zealand psyche, but also that's a reason why it proves so controversial, I think, as well.
It's quite complex, isn't it? Because those that did remain at home and, to work on farms or whatever their essential industries were, often felt that they should have been somewhere else fighting for their country.
Yep.
And there were people with attitudes towards that
Yep.
that made them feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, I mean certainly.
A lifelong regret that they hadn't been able to go because of the responsibilities at home.
Yeah, and a lot of them were quite heavily criticised, particularly single men. If you were a single man who was at home under the essential industry, you had a tough time. during the war. Why were married men being sent by these fit, able single men were staying at home? The RSA was was quite critical, arguing there's far too many exemptions of these young single men. It's not right. And there was also there was a point in the war in 1943 where they started furloughing long service men from the New Zealand Expeditionary Force. They brought some of them back to New Zealand for what was supposed to be a short period of rest before they went back. But there was a big outcry saying, why are these men being sent back when some people haven't gone at all? So that became a very controversial issue as well. But yeah, what you find is, I think one reason why conscription hasn't had much focus in the historiography is if you look at the archives, even if you just do a search for conscription, almost all the records that come up will be conscientious objectors, because very few conscripts wrote about their experiences, or even if they do, they tend to kind of hedge it. They don't say, I was conscripted into the army, they'll say, I was called up, or I was mobilized into the army. I think conscript very quickly became sort of a dirty word, kind of implied something less. And when they started to move towards introducing conscription, the volunteering rate actually went up again, because a lot of people tried to get in while they could as volunteers. Yeah, so yeah, conscript, even those who were conscripted tended to have that stigma, but certainly, yeah, those who stayed at home as well. So, yeah, it's...
My father was conscripted,
Yep.
and I think my mother was conscripted as well.
Yep.
And her diary about trying to run a farm, a small farm, was quite dramatic.
Yep. 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 And industrial conscription was often referred to as manpowering, and yeah, it was often talked about quite negatively. The manpower's coming to get you, or you don't want to fall victim to the manpower. So even when it was women, it was always manpower. But yeah,
Would you be called up to the other end of the country, like manpower?
They did try to keep people close, but there was a lot of complaint in the South Island at the number of people who were being sent up to Wellington, because that's where a lot of the munitions, the tobacco factories, the big industries in the Hutt Valley. So there were complaints from Christchurch and Dunedin that all our young men have been, and our women as well, have been taken away, and you're basically stripping the South Island of all its workers. And there were obvious fears about what that would mean in the post-war world as well. But particularly women, and especially younger women, they tried to keep them close to home. Yeah, there was a number of complaints about that as well. Rural women being taken into urban areas, they'll all fall into a life of sin and that kind of thing. So, yeah, I mean, there's all these things swirling around it, and it's one reason why I find it so fascinating. It is important as part of the war effort. As I said, I think it's absolutely essential to the way New Zealand fights its war, but you also get all these fascinating personal stories, these debates. It tells us so much about society. I mean, what New Zealanders thought society should be like and how it should be like going forward. So it's not just a military subject, although the military side of it's really important. It's a social and cultural subject as well, and that's why I think it's so important.
So you've obviously got an accent. I'm interested that you're so drawn to our history, New Zealand history.
Yep.
Did you have a connection with this type of thing back in the UK?
Well, my granddad was exempted because he worked in an engineering factory, so he was exempted as in essential industry from the Second World War. My other granddad drove tanks in North Africa. For my masters, I looked at conscription in New Zealand in the First World War and those appeals against exemption. That's how I sort of got into it. They're heavily reported in the newspapers. So if you go on Papers Past and search, exemption or appeal board, you'll get heaps of results. And so you've got these public hearings where men and women are coming forward and talking about their circumstances, their farms, their domestic circumstances. So that sort of got me into this as part of my MA, and then PhD. sort of broadened that out for the First World War, and then in a way Second World War was kind of the logical. So that's sort of where it's progressed from. It's not so much a personal thing, it's just that I sort of got into the subject in my masters and got hooked, and as I said, I think it's a subject that needs far more attention. So that's why I'm so interested in it. Yeah.
I have a question about, you said everybody had to get, they might fail a medical, so they must have all had to have a medical. Did they have to conscript the doctors to do it? Where did they get enough to do, check out 123,000 men?
Well, I mean, they weren't all coming forward at once, but there was massive demand, and there were certainly complaints that the exams were too cursory. You had all these reports of people getting in the army and then discovering that they had, chest complaints or something like that, or some people being apparently let off for no reason. And you had some people who tried to game the system. Allegedly, some people chewed large amounts of tobacco before their medical to make the heart seem like they had a heart murmur or something like that, or they knuckle their eyes to make it look like their vision wasn't as good as it was. So yeah, I mean, there was all sort of allegations about that. Apparently the ballot itself was always above board. The only irregularity that came to light was one of the women who was involved in it took their sweetheart's name out of so he couldn't be balloted, but he would have been balloted eventually because everyone was, but yeah, probably bought him a bit of time. So, but apparently it was all very above board. But yeah.
So was there a separate? How did the bureaucracy of it work when they decided on this? Like, who was making the decisions about manpower? And I know, for example, that my grandfather was manpower.
Yep.
He was a baker. And he was directed to where he had to go because there was no baker in that town.
Yep.
So how did that bureaucracy, did it fit in with local government, or was it something separate? Or
what had been the state placement service that was responsible for sort of addressing unemployment and trying to match people up to jobs, that was turned overnight into the manpower office. So each district, I think there were about 21 districts in New Zealand, had its own manpower officer who would be responsible for making these decisions, and then they kind of had assistants, and there would be a manpower office, and then there was the central manpower division of the National Service Department in Wellington. So yeah, it was a massive bureaucracy, and that's another reason why some people didn't like it. They thought, this is the state taking over, and there were questions. A lot of people said, is this just going to be for the war, or is this the Labour government trying to push us towards socialism and those kind of things? And certainly for some in the Labour government, that was an attractive feature of this. Yeah, the manpowering regulations and directions actually continue into 1946 because they still, while they were bringing the men back, there were still major shortages, and New Zealand had to switch over to big food production to send to Europe as part of that. So yeah, there is a huge bureaucracy that grows up around it. Yeah, every district had its own manpower office.
So basically it came out of that sort of like social welfare division?
Yeah. So using the existing machinery, the man who had been responsible for running the Social Security Register became head of the manpower division. So yeah, there's a big link between those two. And the Social Security forms that had been filled out were used as the basis of the military register. So yeah, the existing bureaucracy was sort of co-opted for this purpose. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.